You did not know you were doing it. That is the first thing to say. The reading was not a decision. It was not a strategy you developed and then refined. It was operating before you had words for what it was, before you understood that other children in other houses were not reading anything at all. They were eating their cereal, they were watching the cartoon, they were inside their own attention, undivided. You were not, you were taking in the room, you recognized this, you can feel, even now, the residue of the skill, the way you walk into a space and within seconds know who is angry, who is pretending, who is about to say the thing they should not say. You have been told throughout your life that this is a gift, that you are unusually perceptive, that you have a kind of emotional intelligence others lack. The compliment has always sat strangely on you, because you have known, somewhere underneath the compliment, that the skill was not a gift. The skill was an installation. Something was installed in you very young, because something had to be. The popular literature calls this sensitivity. It speaks of the highly sensitive person, of the empath, of the temperamentally attuned child. It frames the perceptiveness as an inherent trait, a way you were born, a wiring you came with, a special configuration of the nervous system that you happen to inherit. Some of this is true. Some children are, by constitution, more permeable to environment than others. But the framing leaves out something the framing is not equipped to see. It treats the sensitivity as a property of the child, when in many cases the sensitivity was a response to the household. The child did not arrive sensitive, the child arrived ordinary, and the household required of her a level of attention that ordinary children are not asked to provide. And the attention, repeated daily for years, became the only nervous system she had ever known. This is the distinction the popular framing cannot quite afford to make, because to make it would be to say that what looks like a temperament is, in many cases, a survival adaptation, and survival adaptations, unlike temperaments, are made of grief. They have a cost. They were paid for by a child who did not know she was paying. Jung observed in his work on the development of personality that the child does not develop in isolation. The child develops inside what he called the psychic atmosphere of the family, the unspoken tensions, the unprocessed material of the parents, the things the household was not saying. The child is not protected from this atmosphere by her youth. She is, in fact, more porous to it than the adults around her, because she does not yet have the defenses that adults use to shut out what is unbearable. She breathes the atmosphere directly, she metabolizes it, and the metabolizing leaves marks that are not behavioral, not psychological in the surface sense, but structural. They become part of how she perceives. The household you grew up in had an atmosphere. You did not name it at the time, because it was the only atmosphere you had ever breathed. And one does not name the air, but you read it. You read the pressure changes. You read the moment your father came home and the temperature of the kitchen shifted by some imperceptible degree. You read the tightness in your mother's voice that signaled, without language, that the evening was about to require care. You read the silences, not the comfortable silences, but the ones that had a charge, the ones that meant something was being held back, the ones that meant someone was deciding whether to speak. You read all of this continuously, while also doing your homework, while also being a child, while also pretending, and this is the part that matters, that you were not reading anything at all, because the reading had to be invisible. That was the second condition. The first condition was that the reading had to be accurate. The second was that no one in the household could know it was happening, because if the parents had known they were being read, the reading would have been registered as a violation. The child who reads the parent is the child who has seen the parent. And in many households, the unspoken contract is that the parent must not be seen. The parent must be allowed to maintain the version of themselves they need to maintain in order to function. The child who notices the cracks in that version becomes, by her noticing, a threat to the system, so the noticing must be covered. The reading must be done from underneath. The child must develop two faces, the visible one, which is doing what a child does, and the invisible one, which is performing the continuous calibration that keeps the household from coming apart. You recognize this. You can remember the specific feeling of holding two attentions at once, the conversation you were having with your sibling and the conversation your parents were having in the next room, both processed in parallel, with the second conversation receiving the greater portion of your processing power. You did not experience this as effort. It was simply what attention was for you. Attention was layered. Attention was divided. Attention was always in some part of itself, listening past the immediate situation to the larger situation that the immediate one was nested inside. And this layering, which the household required and which you produced without being asked, became your default mode of being in the world. The cost was not visible to anyone, including you. The cost was that you never developed, in the way other children developed, the capacity for single-pointed attention. You never knew what it was to be inside one thing only. Every experience, for as long as you could remember, was already accompanied by the surveillance of the larger field. And so, when adults in your life asked you whether you were enjoying something, the meal, the trip, the gathering, you did not quite know how to answer, because enjoyment, as the question was framing it, required a kind of immersion that you did not have access to. You had been trained out of immersion. You had been trained instead into a peripheral awareness so complete that the center where enjoyment is supposed to live had become structurally inaccessible. This is the part the popular framing does not name. The empath is not someone with a heightened capacity to feel. The empath is someone who has lost the capacity to be inside one feeling at a time. Every feeling she has is accompanied by the reading of the room. Every joy is tracked against the question of whether the joy is permitted. whether the joy is making someone uncomfortable, whether the joy is about to be punished by the next shift in the atmosphere. The peripheral surveillance does not turn off. It cannot turn off. It is not a setting, it is the architecture, or rather, more precisely, it became the architecture. It was not always so. Somewhere, very early, before the household required the watching, before the watching became continuous, before the continuous watching became structural, there was a version of you that did not yet know how to read. There was a child who walked into a room and saw a room, not a system. There was a child who heard her mother speak and heard speech, not whether. That child existed. She existed before the installation and the work of the long second half of life. For the empath who begins to understand what was done is in some measure the work of meeting that earlier child again, not to retrieve her in the sentimental sense, but to acknowledge that she was real, that the reading was not original to you, that something happened between her and the person you became. A patient once came to me with this dream in the middle of her 50s, after she had begun to recognize what I am describing. She dreamed she was in the kitchen of her childhood home. She was the age. She actually was not regressed, not a child in the dream, but an adult woman. She was washing dishes. The house was empty. Her parents were dead by then in waking life, and they were dead in the dream as well. But the house had not been emptied of their atmosphere. She could feel them in the rooms, and then, at the doorway of the kitchen, a small girl appeared. The girl was perhaps 4 years old. The girl was looking at her with an expression that was not childish. It was the expression of someone who had been working for a very long time. The girl said, "I have been watching them for you. Can I stop now?" And the dreamer, in the dream, sat down on the kitchen floor and could not answer, because she did not know how to give permission for something to stop that had been happening for 50 years. What the girl in that dream represented, in the language of complex psychology, was the structural arrangement that had been formed when the watching became permanent. The dreamer had not, in any meaningful sense, met that arrangement consciously. She had been living through it. She had been operating from inside it. The dream was the first time the arrangement had presented itself to her as something other than her own personality. The dream was the first time she had been able to see the watching as separate from herself. And the dream's question, "Can I stop now?" was the question that no one in the household had ever been able to ask, because the household had required the watching, and the watching had required its own invisibility, and the invisibility had required that no one, including the watcher, ever notice that the watching was happening. The dream did not produce the cessation. The dream produced the visibility, and the visibility was the precondition for everything that came after, because you cannot release what you have never seen. You cannot give a different instruction to a part of yourself you have never identified. The reading of the room, for as long as it remains invisible to you, will continue to run. It will run when you are at work. It will run when you are with your partner. It will run when you are with your children. It will run when you are alone in a quiet room with no one to read. And in that case, it will produce, out of its own momentum, the sensation that something is wrong because something must be wrong. Because that is what the reading was built to detect. The reading does not stop in the absence of stimulus. The reading manufactures stimulus when the environment provides none. This is what the dread in the quiet room actually is. When you trace it down to its structural source, the dread is the reading continuing to operate in a context where there is nothing legitimate to read. The system is searching. It is searching the way a search algorithm searches when the database has been emptied. It does not stop searching. It produces phantom results. It returns false positives. It generates, out of its own architecture, the sensation of threat that justifies its continued operation, and the empath, who has lived inside this system her whole life, experiences the false positives as if they were real readings. She thinks the calm is dangerous. She thinks something is wrong. She does not yet recognize that the wrongness is being produced by the reading itself. In the absence of anything to read, the recognition of this is not pleasant. It is one of the harder thresholds the work asks you to cross, because the recognition involves the admission that much of what you have taken to be intuition throughout your life was not intuition at all. It was the reading dressed up as insight, the reading sold to you by the popular literature as a gift, the reading praised by friends and partners who benefited from your continuous calibration of their states. You have been congratulated for the very thing that was costing you the capacity to be inside your own life. And to release the reading, you have to be willing to release the identity that the reading conferred, the identity of the one who knows, the one who senses, the one who reads people accurately. That identity is real. It is also, in significant measure, a survival adaptation in costume. The costume is sophisticated. The costume has fooled the people around you and, for most of your life, has fooled you. What Jung was describing when he spoke of individuation included this kind of unmasking, not in the cinematic sense of removing a false self and discovering a true one underneath, in the slower, more grinding sense of recognizing that what you had taken for your nature was, in many of its specifics, a response to a particular set of conditions that no longer obtain. The household is gone. The parents may be dead or may be old and powerless. The atmosphere you were reading is no longer in the room. And yet the reading continues, because the reading became you, and the dissolution of the reading feels from the inside like the dissolution of the self. The dissolution is not the dissolution of the self. It is the dissolution of one arrangement within the self. There is more here than that arrangement. There has always been more, but you cannot find what is more until you have seen, clearly and without flinching, what the arrangement was, what it cost, and what it has been doing in the absence of the conditions that originally required it. The sensitivity has been named. The complement that hid the wound is no longer available. There is a particular silence that follows this kind of recognition. It is not the silence of relief. It is the silence of a person who has just understood that a story she has been telling about herself for most of her life was not the whole story. The story said, I am sensitive, I feel deeply, I am attuned to others in a way that is rare. The story was not false, but it was incomplete, and the incompleteness was structural. What the story did not say could not say, because the story was the survival mechanism. Speaking in its own defense was that the attunement had a history. The attunement was not the beginning. The attunement was the answer to a question that had been put to a very young child long before she could refuse to answer. The question was this: can you keep us from coming apart? Not in words. The question was never in words. It was in the atmosphere, in the looks, in the long silences that meant someone was about to say the unsayable. The child did not register the question as a question. She registered it as the climate of being alive. And she answered the question every day by becoming the kind of child whose attention could be borrowed by the household at any moment, without notice, for purposes she did not fully understand. The answering was the development. The development was the answering. There was no version of her, after a certain age, that existed apart from the answering. This is what makes the work of recognition so disorienting, because the part of you that is doing the recognizing is itself a product of what is being recognized. The empath who begins to see in middle life that her sensitivity was an installation rather than an inheritance is using the very faculties the installation produced in order to perform the seeing. She is reading her own past with the reading apparatus the past built. There is no neutral position from which to observe what was done to her. The observer is implicated. The observer is, in some measure, the thing being observed. Jung was alert to this difficulty in a way that the contemporary frameworks tend to skim. He understood that the analysis of one's own complexes is never a clean operation, because the analyst-self and the analyzed self are continuous. The empath who studies her own attunement is studying it with an apparatus that was forged inside the same household that required the attunement. She cannot step outside the apparatus. She can only, over time, develop a slightly different relationship to it, one in which the apparatus is occasionally addressed, occasionally questioned, occasionally relieved of its certainty. The relationship is not the dissolution of the apparatus. The relationship is the only available form of the work, so she begins to ask, in small ways, what the reading is doing right now. Not to stop the reading. The reading does not stop, but to make the reading visible to itself, to say quietly, in the middle of a conversation with a colleague I am reading him, I am tracking his micro expressions. I am calibrating my next sentence based on what his eyes did 3 seconds ago. This is happening. I did not decide for it to happen. It happened before I noticed it was happening. And the noticing, which is itself a kind of reading, does something curious to the original reading. It does not cancel it. It loosens it. The reading is still operating. But the reading is now accompanied by a witness, and the witness is not herself a subject of the household. The witness is something newer. The witness is the third presence beginning her work. The third presence does not announce herself. She makes her arrival known through small reductions in the urgency of the reading. The reading used to be experienced as life and death, as if missing a single signal in the room would result in a catastrophe that the empath was solely responsible for preventing. With the witness present, the reading becomes more like a continuous low-level commentary. It is still happening, it is still detailed, but it has lost some portion of its grip. The empath can hear the reading say, "He is angry," and she can register the reading without immediately moving into the calibration response. She can let the reading stand without acting on it. The reading does not require her labor in order to exist. The reading exists, and she, separately, decides what, if anything, to do with the reading's output. This is a smaller change than it sounds, and a larger one, smaller, because it does not transform the underlying architecture. The reading still runs. The reading will probably run, in some form, for the rest of her life. Larger, because the relationship between the reading and the rest of her has fundamentally reorganized. The reading used to be the executive function. It used to be the one making the decisions. With the witness present, the reading becomes a department reporting upward. Its information is received, its information is weighed, its information is no longer automatically converted into action. I will return to this in a moment. Because it requires a kind of patience to describe accurately. But first there is something else that has to be named, because without naming it, the rest of the work cannot land. The reading, throughout your childhood, was not only directed at the people in the household, it was also, simultaneously, directed at yourself. You were reading the others, and you were reading what the others were reading in you, and you were calibrating yourself based on what you detected. They were detecting. The loop was closed. There was no part of you that was outside the loop. Every expression you produced was already filtered before it left your face by the prediction of how it would land. Every sentence you said was pre-edited based on what the room could tolerate. You did not experience this as performance. You experienced it as personality. What this means, structurally, is that the self you take to be yourself, the one with the preferences, the opinions, the characteristic phrases, the recognizable way of being in the world, was assembled, in large part, from materials approved by the household. The household did not approve them by decree. The household approved them by what it permitted, what it punished, what it ignored, and what it rewarded with the rare and precious commodity of parental warmth. The child, scanning continuously for that commodity, learned which versions of herself produced it and which versions did not. The versions that did not produce it were not destroyed. They were filed. They were placed in storage, where they have remained for decades, while the versions that did produce it became the public self. The public self is not a lie. It is a selection, and the selection was made by a child who did not know she was making it under conditions that did not give her any other option. To call this self false is to misunderstand the situation. The self is real, the self is operational, the self has carried you through your life and accomplished things and formed relationships and produced work that has meaning. The self is not the problem. The problem is the assumption that the self is the totality. The problem is the absence of any conscious relationship to the filed material, the versions of you that were not approved, that were not rewarded, that were quietly archived in childhood and have been sitting in their drawers ever since. The drawers, like the small self in the chair from the earlier dream, are patient. They do not knock, they do not demand, they wait, and what they wait for in the long run of a life is the moment when the conditions that produced the original filing have receded enough that the drawers can be opened without immediate threat. The household is gone. The parents are old or dead. The marriage that reproduced the household dynamics is perhaps ended. The job that required the public self is perhaps no longer the center of your life. The exterior has quieted, and in the quiet, almost without your noticing, the drawers begin to open, not all at once, one at a time. A version of you that was filed at 6 years old appears briefly in a flicker of preference you cannot explain. A version of you that was filed at 12 appears in a sudden, surprising reaction to a song you had not heard since you were that age. A version of you that was filed at 23 appears in a dream that gives you back, for a few seconds, a quality of seeing the world that you had completely forgotten you ever possessed. This is what the contemporary literature calls reconnection with the inner child, and the phrasing does the experience no favors. The phrasing makes it sound like a single child waiting in a single room. The actual experience is more like the slow reopening of a long-sealed archive in which every age of your life is filed in its own drawer, and the drawers open at their own pace, in their own order, according to a logic that is not yours to determine. The empath who has begun this work does not encounter her inner child. She encounters a succession of selves, each one carrying material that the household required to be put away, each one returning now because the room is finally empty enough for her to be heard. Some of what returns is pleasant, the capacity for delight that the household could not tolerate, the flash of curiosity that was always being subordinated to the management of the room, the strain of laughter that had no defensive function, that was not calibrated, that came from somewhere underneath the calibration entirely. These returns are gifts. They are the recovery of capacities that had been lost without your knowing they were lost. Other returns are not pleasant. The anger that the household punished and that has been waiting, accumulated and compressed for decades, the grief that was never permitted because the household needed you operational, the clarity about what the parents actually were, not the sanitized version, not the version the family agreed to maintain, but the version the child saw and was forbidden to speak, which now, with no one to forbid it, becomes available to the adult mind. These returns are harder. They do not feel like recovery. They feel like an indictment, and the empath encountering them often experiences a kind of panic that resembles the original panic of the household, because the returns are bringing back the very material the original survival adaptation was designed to suppress. This is the moment at which much of the work breaks down for people who undertake it without adequate framing. They encounter the harder returns, they experience the panic, and they conclude, mistakenly, that they have made things worse, that the healing has destabilized them, that they were better off when the material was still filed. Some of them retreat, some of them return to the survival adaptation with renewed conviction, because the survival adaptation, whatever it cost, did at least keep this from being felt. And the retreat is understandable. The retreat is, in some cases, what the person is able to do at that point in her life. And judgment of it would be a kind of cruelty, but for the empath who is able to stay, and staying is not an act of will, it is a function of having developed enough internal capacity to receive what is returning. The harder returns are not the end of the work. They are the middle, they are the substance through which the conversion takes place, because the returns are not, in the deepest sense, a destabilization, they are a remembering, literally a putting back together of members that had been separated. The household required the separation. The household required that certain materials be kept out of consciousness in order for the household to function. The separation was the price of admission. The conversion is the gradual, slow rejoining of what was separated, which is experienced from the inside as instability, only because the old organization is being asked to disassemble in favor of a new one. Jung had a phrase for this disassembly. He called it the descent into the unconscious, and he understood it as a necessary stage of individuation rather than a symptom of psychological failure. The descent is not optional. The descent is what makes the integration possible. You cannot integrate what you have not first allowed to surface, and the surfacing has its own pace, which is not yours to control. The empath who tries to control the pace of the surfacing, who insists on bringing up the material faster than her current capacity can metabolize it, or who insists on suppressing the material when it begins to surface against her will, both of these strategies prolong the work. The work proceeds at the pace at which she is able to allow it to proceed. The pace is not negotiable. The pace is the body's and the unconscious's and the household's residue, working out what is ready to be felt and what is not, what can be cultivated. In the meantime, is not the pace, but the company, the empath who undergoes the descent in isolation, with no one, not a therapist, not a friend who has done this work, not a written tradition to consult, is doing something that the literature on individuation has consistently warned against, not because she is incapable, because the material is large, and the apparatus that is trying to receive it is the apparatus that was formed under the conditions that created the material. To do the work entirely alone is to ask the survival adaptation to supervise its own dissolution. The survival adaptation is not the right supervisor. The survival adaptation has a vested interest in maintaining itself. Some other presence has to be in the room. Sometimes that presence is a person, sometimes it is a tradition, sometimes it is the slow, accumulated company of what Jung would have called the self, the larger ordering of the psyche, which becomes more available the longer one has been listening for it. But some other presence has to be present. The reading on its own is not equipped to release itself. It will need to be witnessed by something other than itself. The witness has been forming, in your case, for longer than you have realized. She is not new. She is the part of you that was never quite captured by the household, that has been keeping company with the small selves in their drawers, that has been waiting for the conditions under which she could step forward. The conditions are arriving, the drawers are opening, and the work from here is not to manage the opening. The work is to learn slowly who is opening them. The question of who is opening the drawers is not rhetorical. It is the precise question that the work at this stage requires you to hold, because the answer to it is not obvious, and the wrong answer can keep you inside the survival adaptation for another decade. The first instinct, when the drawers begin opening, is to assume that you are opening them, that this is your work, your healing, your achievement. The instinct is understandable. It places you back in the familiar role of the one who manages, the one who does the labor, the one whose effort is the engine of whatever change is occurring. The instinct is also, in a way that takes some time to see, a continuation of the very pattern the work is meant to address, because the empath, for as long as you have been alive, has been the one who makes things happen. The reading was your labor. The calibration was your labor. The continuous maintenance of relational stability in every room you entered was your labor. To imagine that the healing too is your labor is to apply the survival adaptation to the dissolution of the survival adaptation. It is to say, I will manage this the way I managed everything else. I will read the signals. I will calibrate the response. I will produce the appropriate outcome. The reading does not know any other mode. Given a new task, even the task of its own undoing, it will attempt to perform that task in the only way it knows how. This is why so many people who undertake this kind of work find themselves 2 or 3 years in, exhausted in a way they cannot quite explain. They have been doing the right things. They have been reading the books, attending the sessions, journaling, meditating, attending to the body, and something is wrong. The exhaustion does not lift. The dread does not soften. The drawers, if they are opening at all, seem to be opening on a schedule that does not respond to their effort. They begin to suspect that they are doing the healing wrong. The suspicion is incorrect. They are not doing the healing wrong. They are doing the healing by means of the very faculty that the healing is supposed to relieve. They are using the watchman to dismantle the watchman, and the watchman, given that assignment, will perform it the way he performs every assignment, with continuous vigilance, with anxious attention to results, with the underlying terror that if he does not produce the outcome, no one will. What Jung was attempting to describe in his later writings was a shift in the location of the agency, not the elimination of effort. Effort remains, but the seat from which the effort issues changes. In the survival adaptation, the effort issues from a position of contraction, from a part of the self that believes itself to be solely responsible for the outcome, that cannot rest, that cannot delegate, that cannot trust any other faculty to operate without supervision in what Jung called the conscious relation to the self. The effort issues from a wider position. The wider position knows that it is not solely responsible. The wider position can permit other faculties to operate. The wider position can rest, not because the work is finished, but because the work does not depend on continuous management to continue. The third presence, who has been forming for longer than you realized, is the developing capacity to act from this wider position. She is not someone separate from you. She is the version of you that was never quite consumed by the survival adaptation. She is the residual self that has been waiting throughout your life for the conditions under which she could assume the executive function. The conditions are these: that the survival adaptation has been seen for what it is, that its labor has been honored without being made permanent, that the harder returns from the archive have been allowed to surface, and that you have begun to recognize in your own daily experience that the management of your life does not require your continuous vigilance. This last recognition arrives in pieces. It arrives the first time you notice that you have gone an entire afternoon without scanning. It arrives the first time you realize that a friend you used to manage carefully calibrating each sentence to her current mood has not, in fact, fallen apart in the absence of your calibration. It arrives the first time you let a small disagreement remain unresolved overnight, and you wake in the morning and the world is still there, and the relationship is still there, and the catastrophe the watchman predicted has not occurred. These small evidences accumulate. They are not individually dramatic. They are in aggregate, the slow construction of an alternative experience of being alive, the experience of being alive without the watchman in command. And here is the part of the work that the popular framing tends to skip past entirely, because the popular framing wants to deliver you to a resolution, the wider self, the third presence, the self in Jung's capitalized sense. This presence does not arrive with the equipment to immediately replace the watchman's function. She is younger, in operational terms, than the watchman. She has not had the years of practice. She has been forming in silence, under cover, while the watchman handled the front of the house. When she begins to step forward, she does not yet know how to do everything the watchman knew how to do. There is a transitional period in which the empath is, in some real sense, less competent than she used to be. This is the part nobody warns you about. The watchman, for all his cost, was extraordinarily good at what he did. He kept the household together, he kept the friendships intact, he kept the workplace stable, he read the room with a precision that very few non-trauma-formed adults can match. To begin to act from the wider self is, initially, to act with less precision. The wider self does not scan as fast. She does not calibrate as accurately. She lets things land that the watchman would have caught. She allows misunderstandings that the watchman would have prevented, and the empath, observing this, often experiences a kind of grief for the watchman's competence, mixed with an anxiety that she is, in some sense, regressing. She is not regressing, she is redistributing the work the watchman had been doing, which was at its peak. The work of about 3 full-time employees compressed into a single nervous system is being slowly distributed among the various faculties of the larger self. The wider self does not do all of it alone. She delegates. She permits things to go untended that the watchman would have tended. She accepts losses that the watchman would have prevented at any cost. And the empath, who has lived her whole life inside a system that did not accept losses, has to learn very slowly that some losses are the cost of a life that is no longer organized around their prevention. The relationships that cannot survive the lowered calibration were not, in retrospect, relationships. They were transactions in which her labor was the currency. They end. They were always going to end. They were sustained throughout their duration by her continuous payment of a tax she did not know she was paying. This is one of the harder griefs of the second half of the work, the grief for what falls away when the calibration stops. It is not the grief for the household, or for the parents, or for the marriage that ended. It is the grief for the wide circle of relationships and obligations and small loyalties that turn out, when the calibration is withdrawn, to have been resting entirely on the calibration. They cannot bear their own weight. They were never built to, they were built to be carried by you. And when you put them down, they do not stand. They fall, and you are left with the smaller, truer circle of relationships that can bear their own weight, that did not require your continuous management, that have been throughout your life, the actual relationships underneath the noise of everything else. The smaller, truer circle is often startlingly small. This is another thing the popular framing does not say. The empath who completes this work does not, in most cases, emerge with a wider social life. She emerges with a narrower one, in which the residents are people who could meet her without her labor and have been meeting her quietly all along. She had not been able to see them clearly before, because the calibration had been consuming the attention required to see them. Now she can see them. They have been there. They are not in large numbers. There may be 3 of them. There may be 1. The number is not the measure. The measure is that the relationships are not any longer performances. I once treated a man in his 60s who came to me in the final years of his working life, after he had begun to suspect that the entire arrangement of his existence had been organized around something he could not name. He was a competent man. He had a marriage, a career, friends. He moved through his life with apparent grace. But underneath the grace, he told me, there was an exhaustion he had been carrying since adolescence, and he could no longer pretend the exhaustion was incidental. We worked together for several years. The work was slow. He resisted, sometimes for months. The recognition that his perceptiveness, which had been the foundation of his professional success, was an installation from a childhood in which his mother's volatility had required continuous management. The recognition, when it finally came, did not arrive as breakthrough. It arrived as something quieter. He came into a session and said, "I think I have been performing my entire life, and I do not know what is underneath the performance. I do not know if there is anything underneath it." This is the question the wider self has to answer, not theoretically, but operationally. Over the years that follow the recognition, she has to discover, by living, what is underneath the performance. The discovery is not made in a single revelation. It is made in the small preferences, the unexpected fatigue, the strange and sometimes uncomfortable returns of material from the archive. The wider self does not have a manifesto. She does not arrive with a position on who she is. She arrives with a willingness to find out, and the finding out takes the rest of the life that is available. In the man I am describing, the finding out took about 4 years. He retired earlier than he had planned. He did not retire to do something more meaningful. He retired because he recognized, with a clarity that surprised him, that the career had been part of the performance, and that continuing the performance was no longer compatible with the work he was doing. The retirement was not a triumphant move toward authenticity. It was a relinquishment. He gave up the public competence. He gave up the recognition that came with it. He gave up, in some measure, the version of himself that other people had come to depend on. And in the space the relinquishment opened, very slowly, something else began to occupy the room. He started keeping bees. He had not been raised with bees. He had no family history with them. The bees arrived in his life through a sequence of small preferences he could not fully explain. He sat with them in the afternoons. He learned their seasons. He found, sitting with them, that the exhaustion that had been with him since adolescence was, for the first time in his memory, not present in his body. It was not that he had healed it. It was that, with the performance no longer running, the exhaustion no longer had the labor it had been responding to. The exhaustion lifted because its cause had been removed. He did not become a beekeeper in any public sense. He did not write about it. He did not lecture about it. He simply, for the last decade of his life, kept bees and lived with his wife and saw the small circle of people who had been there all along and did almost nothing else. By the standards of his earlier life, this would have looked like a collapse. By the standards he had come to operate from, it was the first time he had been inside his own life. The watchman had retired. The wider self had taken up the room, and the room turned out to be, in the most literal sense, smaller than the room the watchman had been maintaining. The wider self did not need as much space. The wider self did not need the audience. The wider self needed only the conditions under which she could be present to what was actually happening. Without the continuous translation of every event into a problem the watchman could be assigned to solve, this is what Jung was pointing toward, I believe, when he spoke of the late phase of individuation as a kind of simplification rather than an expansion. The expanded life is the survival adaptation's life. The expanded life requires the survival adaptation to maintain it. The simplified life is what becomes possible when the survival adaptation is no longer in charge. It is not a smaller life, it is a less symptomatic one. The activities are fewer because fewer activities are now functioning as defenses. The relationships are fewer because fewer relationships are now functioning as performances. The interior is more populated because the drawers have opened and the selves that were filed are now circulating, but the exterior has contracted to what the interior can actually inhabit, rather than what the survival adaptation needed to perform. The empath who arrives at this kind of simplification is not, in any obvious way, a more impressive person than she was before. She may be, by external measures, less impressive. She is doing less. She is producing less. She is reading the room less. She is, in some moments, missing things that her previous self would have caught. She is also, for the first time in her life, inside one thing at a time. The peripheral attention that consumed her childhood has begun to release its grip on the center. The center is finally available, and the center, when it is finally available, turns out to be a much quieter place than she had imagined. The quietness is what surprises her most, not because she had expected noise, but because she had not, in any of her preparations for this stage of life, formed an accurate image of what it would feel like to live without the continuous broadcast of the reading. She had imagined, vaguely, that the end of the survival adaptation would feel like peace. She had imagined something like an arrival. What she encounters instead is a kind of plainness, a neutrality of experience that, in the first months of its presence, she does not quite know what to do with. The events of her day are happening, and they are not being narrated. The conversations she has with the few people who remain in her circle are happening, and they are not being calibrated. The meal she is eating is being eaten, and the eating is not accompanied by the running commentary that had, for as long as she could remember, run underneath every meal she had ever consumed. The commentary had been so continuous that she had not registered it as commentary. She had taken it for thought. She had taken it for awareness. She had believed, in the way most people believe about their own internal experience, that what was happening inside her head was simply what consciousness was, that there was no other way for consciousness to operate. The reading, in this sense, had been not only her labor, but her ontology. It had been what she meant when she said the word I, and a gradual quieting of the reading which is what the work has been producing without her quite noticing, has produced, as a consequence, a gradual loosening of what I refers to. This is the part of the work that is hardest to describe in language, because language itself was formed inside the reading. The pronouns assume a continuous narrator. The grammar assumes a single subject moving through time with a coherent perspective. The experience that emerges in the late phase of the work is something language was not built to hold. It is not that the narrator disappears, it is that the narrator becomes one voice among several, and the several voices do not any longer contend for control. They simply operate. The reading still happens in attenuated form. The watchman still notices. The small selves from the drawers contribute their material. The wider self holds the room. None of them is in charge in the way the watchman used to be. None of them is required to be in charge, because the room has stopped being the kind of room that requires a single sovereign authority to keep from collapsing. The room, by this point, has stopped being a room at all in the metaphorical sense. The work began with the metaphor of the watchman and the household and the drawers was useful when you were first beginning to recognize what had been done to you. It gave you a language for what was operating beneath the surface. It gave you a way to address what had previously been invisible. But the metaphor, like all metaphors in the inner life, is something you outgrow. The interior, in the late phase, is not a house with rooms. It is something more continuous, more lateral, more strange. The selves you had thought of as occupants are not occupants. They are weather. They move through. They are part of a circulation that does not have rooms because it does not have walls. A patient once described this to me in the 8th year of her work with an image I have not been able to improve. She said, "It is as if I have been living in a house my whole life, and I have been so busy moving from room to room that I never noticed that the house was all along, sitting in a field, and now the walls are gone, and the field is what was always there, and the rooms were a way of organizing my attention so that I would not have to see the field. The field is enormous. The field has weather. The field has its own life, and I am in the field. I have always been in the field. I just could not, until now, allow myself to know it." This is not a description of enlightenment in the way the contemporary spirituality literature uses the word. It is something more modest and more accurate. It is the description of what happens when the survival adaptation that was organizing a life into manageable compartments releases its grip on the compartmentalization, and the underlying continuity of experience becomes available to the conscious mind. The compartments were not lies. The compartments were a real, functional response to a real, functional necessity. The child needed to compartmentalize. The household required it, and the compartmentalization, like all sophisticated survival adaptations, did not announce itself as a temporary measure. It announced itself as the structure of the world. The work, over years, is the slow recognition that the compartmentalization is not the structure of the world. It is the structure of a particular response to a particular set of conditions, and when the conditions change, the structure can change with them, though much more slowly than the conditions. Jung described something like this in his work on the relation between the ego and the larger self, though his language for it tends, in translation, to sound more mystical than the experience itself warrants. The experience is not mystical. The experience is the practical consequence of having lived long enough and worked carefully enough that the parts of the psyche which had been operating in isolation begin to come into communication with each other. The communication is not, in most cases, dramatic. It does not involve visions or revelations. It involves, more often, a kind of decrease in internal contradiction. The empath who used to have an opinion and simultaneously the unconscious belief that the opinion was dangerous to hold, finds that the opinion now stands in her unopposed. She can hold it, she can speak it, she does not need to soften it for the room. The room can have it or not have it, and her holding of it does not depend on the room's reception. This is a smaller change than the language makes it sound, and a larger one, smaller, because in any individual moment it looks like nothing much like an ordinary person stating an ordinary view. Larger, because for the empath the entire psychic infrastructure that made stating an ordinary view conditional on the room's permission has, by this point, been reorganized. The view is now hers. The room is now the room. The two are not any longer fused. The fusion that the household required between her interior and the household's atmospheric demands has been undone, not by a heroic act, by the accumulated effect of years of small recognitions, slow grievings, gradual redistributions of the labor the watchman used to perform alone. The undoing of the fusion produces, in its later stages, a curious phenomenon that the literature on individuation rarely describes accurately. The empath becomes, by ordinary measures, less interesting. She has fewer striking insights about other people. She produces fewer of the dazzling perceptual reads that used to characterize her presence in any room. She is, in conversation, often quieter. She has less to say, not because she has less to think, but because the production of conversational content for the maintenance of social fabric is no longer a function she is performing. The content used to be generated, in part, by the reading produced material continuously. The material became the speech, with the reading attenuated. The material is reduced, and the empath, who used to be praised for her perceptiveness, finds herself, in some social settings, almost mute. This is not depression. This is not withdrawal. This is the cessation of a particular kind of productivity that had been mistaken by her and by the people around her for personality. The personality remains. The personality is, in fact, more available than it has ever been, because it is no longer being continuously overridden by the reading's output, but the personality, when it is finally available, turns out to be a quieter instrument than the reading was. The personality does not generate continuous commentary. The personality speaks when it has something to say and is silent when it does not. The shift is not, from the outside, impressive. From the inside, it is the first time in her life that her speech and her experience have been continuous with each other. There is a dream a patient brought to me in the late phase of her work that captures, more economically than any description, what this stage looks like from inside the dreaming psyche. She dreamed she was in a room with several other people, all of them adults, all of them familiar to her in the way dream figures sometimes are, without being identifiable as anyone specific. They were talking. The talk was not about anything important. It was the ordinary murmur of people sharing a space. In the dream, she realized she had not spoken for some time. She had been listening. The listening was not vigilant. The listening was not extracting information for later use. The listening was just listening. And one of the other figures turned to her and said, "You have stopped working." She heard this in the dream, not as a criticism, but as an observation. She nodded. She said, in the dream, what she could not have said in waking life until that year, "I have stopped working. I think I am finally allowed to." And the figure who had spoken did not respond. The figure turned back to the conversation. The conversation continued without her contribution. The room remained a room. She remained in the room. Nothing was required of her, and she woke, and for the rest of the day, in waking life, she carried with her the impression of the dream's permission. She had stopped working. She was, perhaps for the first time, allowed to. The permission, of course, was not granted by the dream figure. The permission was granted by the part of her psyche that had been working for years to make the permission possible. The dream figure was a messenger. The message was that the long internal negotiation had reached a stage at which the cessation of the labor was no longer a threat to her continued existence. The labor could stop, the room would continue, the relationships that mattered would continue, the life would continue. The world she had spent her childhood believing she was solely responsible for holding together would not, in fact, collapse if she put it down. It had never required her holding. The household had required her holding. The household was gone, and the world, which she had been managing as if it were a continuation of the household, was not a continuation of the household. The world was the field. The field had always been there. She had been organizing her attention so as not to see it. This is what the late phase of the work makes available, not a new self, not a healed self, not the triumphant arrival of the authentic person underneath the performance. The late phase makes available a different relationship to the field. The reading, which had been her interface with the field for as long as she could remember, is no longer the only interface. She can stand in the field without reading it. She can let the field be the field. The information continues to arrive. She does not have to convert it into labor. She does not have to convert it into anything. The field exists, and she exists in it. and the two facts are no longer in tension. What has been named here is what you have been living. The sensitivity that was praised was a survival skill in costume. The skill was real, and the praise was, in its way, sincere, but the praise belonged to the costume rather than to you. Underneath the costume, there has been, all this time, a different self forming slowly in conditions you did not create and could not have created, by means of materials that the household required you to file away and that have been waiting in their drawers for the room to grow quiet enough that they could return to you without immediate danger. The room has grown quiet. The drawers have begun their long opening. The reading has lost its sovereignty without losing its existence, and what remains, in the place where the watchman used to stand, is something the language we have inherited does not quite have a name for. Not the absence of the watchman, not a replacement for the watchman, something wider, that includes the watchman, that includes the small selves, that includes the third presence, and that is not any longer organized around the question the household asked you when you were too young to know it had been asked. The question has been answered. The answer was given by a child who did not know she was giving it, and the answer has now been revoked by an adult who has at last the standing to revoke it.
This has been Carl Jung Original, a space where the patterns most people live through can finally be named. Voice and imagery, AI assisted interpretation and framing, original work. Until next lecture.